Okay, so I'm feeling inspired and I have the time to continue reading this article. It has been very fun to explore so far. And if you did watch the other one, you probably noticed that I was speaking in very hushed tones um, because it was still early in the morning and there is someone sleeping still. So maybe now I don't have to be so hushed about it, and I can speak more normally. So here we are at part 2. I think it's basically halfway. I think I can finish this out. So I'm not going to recap what the past one was. I'm just going to keep going. So far, I have set out the following terms: fresh formation of new forms, re-meaning, as when we use the existing words, and coming from underneath. These lead to 3 questions. 1. How do new forms come? 2. When improvisation comes smoothly, is there a and the dot for Gendlin is like, it's a something. It's a felt sense, that murky thing that we don't yet know what it is, but we can sense that it's there, but we just don't have words yet. An implication that hasn't occurred yet, to use his language from a process model. When improvisation comes smoothly, is there a something? Is there an implication? Is there a felt sense? And 3, how does something, new or old, come from underneath? Okay. So before I deal with these questions, let me ask, how do words come to us? We have a vague sense of what we need and want to say, and out come the words to say that. If the wrong words come, we can only apologize, then wait for a moment for the right ones to come. Or perhaps we lack words for a while. None of the usual phrases will say that. Even the word that is not right. What we want to say is not a thing in space to which one could point. Sometimes what we want to say is in some sense already there, but never has yet been said. Then we feel the strain of language rearranging itself to form quite new phrases. So he's kind of rehashing what he has said a little bit, right? Of, trying to say, like, there's something, there's like a feeling, there's like an edge to my thoughts that I don't have words for, but I can tell that it's there. And focusing and thinking at the edge, and Gendlin's work generally is about going into that and finding words for it and coming up with new concepts, coming up with language for our felt senses and moving through that process. Focusing in on that thing which at this moment is inarticulate. We feel something in us that wants to be expressed, but none of the words that we have available to us, or none of the ways to express ourselves that we have available to us so far, will fully express that. And we can tell somatically, that's where the felt sense comes in. Like it's such a mysterious thing, and that's what the process model is really all about too. It's like, how do we know that this word or this way of articulating ourselves about this idea is not accurate? How do I know when I say, like in response to someone asking me, how do I feel? If I say, oh, I'm fine, how do I know that fine isn't true. Assuming that we're not just like outright lying to them, right? Like if we actually are trying to be honest, right? And we say, "Oh, I feel great today." And then you say it and you realize, "Oh, actually great is not it. It's more like excited or like joyous or whatever." Maybe you can't find the word yet, but you can sense in your body. You can sense something, that dot 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 dot. You can sense something that tells you that the word that you just said, the phrase that you just said, isn't it. It's not that. And that's what all of this is about. How words come to us above and thinking beyond patterns. Let me read that again. How words come to us. This coming belongs in a family of comings to which all improvisation belongs. I'm going to have a little fun party later, clicking on all the links in this article, but for now I'm not gonna. So what is this coming, which is the hallmark of improvisation? What else comes in this way that we must await it? We cannot deliberately construct or will to have sleep, appetite, orgasm, tears, love, anger, dreams, imagery, laughter, funny remarks, as well as the words for what we want to say, and the coming of new phrases and new steps in creating a work of art. I'm reminded of, what's his name? Johnny Miller. He posted something recently about, and I think he was referring in part to Michael Ashcroft's stuff about non-doing, and how, Michael Ashcroft has very explicitly written about you can't do sleep. You can't make sleep happen. It's not an action. Gendlin's getting at the exact same thing right here, right? You can't make those things happen. You can't construct or will sleep to happen. Those things come of themselves. You have to stop doing. You have to non-do for those things to occur. And they come in a sort of improvisational way. They come spontaneously. They arise, but you don't make them happen. You create the space and you create the circumstances, but you don't make the thing happen. The list shows that this coming which we cannot construct, which we cannot fully control, and toward which we can only dispose ourselves and wait, this coming is characteristic of the body. Right? Those are all bodily things: sleep, appetite, orgasm, tears, love, anger, dreams, imagery, laughter, final remarks. They come from our body. He talks about making jokes in a process model, how the best ones often arise spontaneously. You can construct jokes, but a lot of the times the best remarks, the most like nail on the head remarks are ones that arise spontaneously because he has a term for this: everything by everything. Everything in our entire life and experience crosses with everything else into the next moment. And everything is a product of everything crossing with everything. And, a spontaneous joke is that unconstructed crossing of everything you have available to you, behind you. Every feeling and every thought and every judgment and all this stuff, right? It comes together of itself, and it just comes out of you, and it's like perfect. It just fully hits the nail on the head in a way that is very, very hard to do if you're trying to construct a joke. You can make sense of the joke afterwards and be like, oh, it's funny because of that and that and that and that. But those things weren't explicitly in your mind when you originally said it, right? So maybe then you go and use that joke, and maybe you perform that joke, but it arose improvisationally. I argue that this kind of coming is always bodily, despite the fact that only some of those on the list would usually be considered bodily. But to recognize them all as from the body changes what the word body has meant until now. The word brings and still means this body, mine in the chair here, but now it also means how I sense this body from the inside. It's sentient, wanting, demanding, prefiguring what I want to say, and after a moment, giving rise to the phrases to say it. So, yeah, I mean, that's when Gendlin talks about body, he's not talking about body from the spectator's point of view or from an analytical, biological, physiological point of view. He's talking about the experience, the phenomenological experience of having and being a body. What's going on inside and how does it feel? What's the experience of having a body? Right? That's what interoception is, the ability to feel your body from the inside. That's what the felt sense is. It's the feeling of your body on the inside. Not like, oh yeah, I have a stomach and I have ribs and I have a bladder and that's where my hip joint is and all that shit. No, none of that matters when we're talking about the phenomenological experience of feeling your body and the experience of the body from the inside, right? You can talk about measuring your heart rate, but you can measure your heart rate without feeling and being able to notice the feeling of your heart beating, right? You can be so out of tune with your ability to notice your body that you can measure your heart rate without being able to feel your heart, which is crazy, but it's very real. Like, there are people for whom the only way to realize that their heart is beating really fast is to take a heart rate measurement, to take their pulse, and they're like, oh shit, my heart is racing. But you can also notice these things somatically. It is the body which lets the next step of speech, action, or art formation to come. An artist stands before an unfinished design, looking, sensing, mulling what it needs. Then perhaps a line is added. Again, the standing back, the mulling. No, that won't do. The line is erased. Again, the standing back. Again and again, line after line is tried out and rejected. The artist feels, mulls, lives what it needs. It is quite precise and demanding. It needs ... It needs something. There's a felt sense there, but that cannot be said in words, only in a line, and the line is not here. The artist feels a next line which does not yet exist. The something is so precise, that felt sense is so precise, it knows why it rejects all so far suggested lines. And we're not talking about just the inner critic and being like, oh, that sucks, that line is bad, right? If you're like writing and you have blank page syndrome. It's like because every little thing that you even attempt to say, something comes in you and you're like, no, fuck that. That's not perfect. People are not going to like that. I don't like that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, oh, I said it and that's not quite right. That's not what I'm trying to express. It's not a judgment of good or bad. It's a judgment of, is this accurate to what I'm trying to express? And it's not in words, right? I mean, we're talking here, it's about an artist and putting that next line into their piece of art, that next brushstroke. It's a felt sense which determines, like, is it right or is it not right? My phrase here is odd, feeling a line that does not yet exist. But what my phrase says is common enough. I could say that the artist feels, senses, lives, is something, the line. Right, let me read that again. I could say that the artist feels the line, right? If the artist feels what is the right next thing. It's not yet there, it's not yet on the page, but as the artist, you can feel what needs to be there. Once a sentence makes the slot of a word, many other words can make sense there. They all cross in the something. Whichever word I now choose will say the something which comes after the string of them. I could say that the artist feels the need, the demand, the idea for, the smell of, the smoke of, the fire of, the scream of, the implying of something, the never yet drawn line. So let me go back here, right? He says cross, and that's in reference to what I was talking about with the everything by everything. Everything crosses together in that something. Everything, all your experience, all your thoughts, all your feelings, all your memory, everything, that huge mass of everything behind you, everything behind this moment crosses in the next moment. And it is that something. It's extremely accurate. And the next line on the page wants to be an expression of that, the crossing of everything. But yet we don't have the line yet. It's still just a something. It's still just a felt sense. And so I think what he's saying, though, with this paragraph is like, once a sentence makes the slot of a word, many other words can make sense there, right? So he's said the thing, right? That you feel the line that does not yet exist. So he's made a slot for a word. And now a lot of other words can work, potentially, right? Feels the need for the line, the demand, the idea for it, the smell of it, etc. All of those things kind of get at that experience of like, there's that thing, what is it? It's something, I know exactly what needs to be there, but it's not yet there. And I know when it's right, and I know when it's not right. Right? It's a feeling. What is that? Each of these words carries the something forward in a somewhat different way. I choose the formal Latin word, now re-meant by what it says here. The body implies the next step. Implicates. There's an implication by everything of what should come next. With this concept with us, we can discuss my 3 questions. 1. How do new forms come? With the something, we can notice quite a lot directly about this implying. The artist can notice that something quite specific is wrong with the effect of each rejected line. All those effects are somehow knowingly rejected by the something, by the felt sense. It is as if the something, had already seen all of those, as if the right line had already been considered, all the wrong effects of them, all, and modified them all together into the something, the right one that isn't here. Right? We can't explain it. We don't know intellectually what is a right line, but we can feel it. It's as if it has been judged, like as if run through an algorithm or something, right? It's like, no, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it, that's closer, that's not it. It's that. What is that? It's right. You can feel what's going to be right. Of course, we know that isn't so. To explain the implying of the right line as having cross-considered all the wrong ones would explain the new formation in terms of pre-existing forms. But all explanatory schemes assume, indeed they are, pre-existing forms that supposedly explain what actually precedes them. Actually, the familiar experience of a sense of a something explains the concept of a crossing. The experience of a something lets us know that the crossing is implicit, that the many parameters that are crossed in it have never existed separately as such. Said in and of a something, the scheme of crossing tells about how the something works by more than a scheme. So I'm understanding this, I think, because of my reading of process model. Right, but so let's say we do get the right line, and then we can explain why it's right. But we can't explain until we've made it. So really we're going back, and now that the something has been crystallized, we can go back and pull out all of these strains of reasoning from what was implying that next line. Previously all of that, everything together, everything that was implying the next line was just one thing. It was undifferentiated, right? It wasn't like, well, this factor and this factor and this factor and this factor. It's just like everything. And then once we make and get to expressing that something accurately, then we can go backwards and be like, okay, well, I can sort of explain why it's right, and I can point and articulate, well, there's this reason, and there's this reason, and there's this reason, and there's this reason. But none of those reasons were really, it's not just those reasons, right? It's the whole thing. But now that we have the result, now that we have the right line, we can at least begin to grasp at and try to explain, like almost like a cause and effect. But it doesn't grasp the entire situation. Right? The experience of a something, that experience of being like, I can feel that there's something that needs to be expressed, and it's super precise. That feeling lets us know that everything behind us is implicit, like all the crossing of everything up to this moment is happening behind us implicitly, and it implies that next something. But all of those parameters are not existing separately from each other. Only once we've arrived at that precise something, then we can look backwards and select the parameters that help us explain what finally did occur. The something has not actually previewed all the wrong lines. There is no such fixed set as all the wrong lines. The wrong lines don't yet exist either. They also come one by one. Indeed, the line the artist takes as right might still have much wrong with it. Actually, the something has not seen, balanced, inter-affected, and crossed any separate lines to imply the next line. We need a term that works like that and still also says that it does not happen like that. In fact, we need a whole vocabulary of new terms that use schemes in a way in which the schemes are exceeded by what functions implicitly and is not a scheme. Right? So it's not like it hasn't been run through an algorithm. It's not like we just have this AI like really fast previewing every line and saying like, oh, no, none of those. It's not, that's not what's happening in the background. And even the line that you do ultimately make might not be the perfect line. And yet, and he doesn't get at this here, but it's something that I imagine he would agree with based on reading his other stuff, is like, maybe you do make the wrong line, right? But the wrong line also changes the situation that you're working with, right? It becomes part of the everything that is now implying the next thing. And so the situation has changed, and the what is now implied is different. You might have made a wrong line, but the implication has changed because the situation has changed. So it's not like you can't do anything until you do the right thing. Each new thing you do changes the situation and therefore changes what's implied. And I haven't read Victor Wooten, but some of the people who I've shared this video and this paper with have read Victor Wooten, and he wrote the music lesson and talks about improvisation and music and how you can like make a mistake in quotes, but it doesn't have to be a mistake. You can just play with that and then work with, right? Like maybe you're doing something and then you play a wrong note accidentally, and then it's like, oh, well, that's not wrong. Like now the situation is I played that note and I can work from there and make it fit. So it's not a mistake. You've just done what you've done, and now the situation has changed and the implication has changed, and you go from there. Visa has talked about that in some of his videos about how he improvises his videos. There's no mistake. You say a wrong word, that's fine. Maybe it's just funny. And the new implication is that like it's a light-hearted video. I'm not serious. I'm not in this mindset of like, oh, if I say a wrong word, I fucked the whole thing up and like this thing needs to go in the trash. It's like, oh, look at me, I'm silly. I said a wrong word. Oops, let's keep going. Or maybe you say a wrong word and you're like, oh, that's interesting that I said that. It's not what I meant, but now that I said that, it makes me think this other thing. And that informs where you go from there. So you don't have to, you're not limited by only being able to express that perfectly implied something, because everything that you do changes the situation and changes what's implied next. And you just keep going. But we don't really have language for that. We don't have a lot of concepts for that, and that's what he's getting at here. We need a whole vocabulary of new terms that use schemes in a way in which the schemes are exceeded by what functions implicitly and is not a scheme, right? All of the stuff behind us that's implying the next move is more than a scheme. It's more than you could ever point to as reasons for what ultimately happens. So yeah, a scheme is helpful. It helps us explain, but it doesn't ever get at everything. I mean, right, there's that whole idea of the map is not the territory. That's kind of gets at it. It's not entirely it, but right. But yeah, that the scheme of the situation is not the whole thing. The territory, the land, the geography, right, which can zoom in on infinitely, that's the real thing. The map is just like a really, really, really low grain version of that. So that's a certain kind of terminology, which is sort of what Gendlin is pointing at. So bodily implying, the word usually says logical deduction, where the conclusion is already contained in the premises. One need only cull it out by rearranging the existing units. But how a something implies how it works, by more than what follows logically by rearranging a set of existing units. Yeah. So implying usually has this association with logic, like if this and this, then that. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? Because the premises are just implied, that we don't have them picked out yet. That's the scheme that he's talking about. You can do it in reverse, be like, well, I had to say that because I felt that and I thought that and it was this situation, but you can never articulate everything that led to the next move. It's not logical in that sense. The next move didn't just exist already as a function of the scheme that you already had articulated. We most clearly feel, sense, are something, the bodily implying as such, when we are stuck, when the next step does not smoothly occur. For example, when the right words don't come. Yeah, I mean, you can feel that. You're like, fuck, I can't think of exactly how to say this right. You can feel that. But here is a further question. Improvised steps may come smoothly, without a break, both in ordinary speech and in other kinds of improvisation. Then the bodily implying is not separate. In that case, how do we know that there is a bodily implying of those steps? Surely there is not an unconscious stuck something underneath the smoothly coming words. That's interesting. Yeah, because like in focusing, it's always about like, Carl Rogers and Gendlin's famous research is about, they realized that the cases in which therapy movement was actually happening was when people were like slowing down and being like, actually, right? So it involved a slowing down and a not knowing of what to say next. But yeah, there is improvisation, a lot of it, fucking jazz, improv comedy, all sorts of stuff where there isn't that slowing down and it all spills out very smoothly. So what's going on there? When steps come smoothly, we cannot examine the implying in advance, but we see something like this crossing of a great many considerations also there. We see it after the coming if we examine the new form. I'm just going to keep going. Swift and smooth improvisation is often imperfect, but sometimes it is amazingly perfect. It can take hours and years to separate out many strands that seem to have gone into determining the spontaneous next move. A good analysis can make it seem that it must have taken months to devise anything that takes account of so many parameters. No, we report, we did not think or feel all of those considerations separately. It just came out like that. And that's actually a fascinating thing. I'm just going to riff off here, actually, rather than seeing what he was actually saying. But, that's the thing with, like, reading the great books or great works of art. It's like there's so much in them, right? You can just spend your whole life examining them and being like, oh, like this, it points back to this and it relates to this and there's making this connection, right? And so in a way, we then are like, man, these artists, these thinkers are fucking geniuses because they implied so much into this work. But maybe our mistake sometimes is to assume that all of that was deliberate, right? Because it's not necessarily. You can get to this place where you're improvising and it can be incredibly perfect, where it does everything crosses perfectly into each next move. And it's not because they were like consciously aware of everything that was being implied, but they were at least, they had the capacity and awareness and sensitivity to always the next move is the perfectly implied next step. And so if you then retroactively look at it and be like, oh, well, what was going on there? Like, how did we get from here to there? You can spend your whole life being like, oh, well, this was the reason. Like, that was the reason that, like, there was an influence. That was an influence, right? You can spend your whole life doing that, and none of that was deliberate. But yeah, it's not, but all of it can be right. Like, all of that is part of the influence, but none of it was explicitly so. And that's like true spontaneity, is everything by everything. Everything crosses into that exact next implied line, that next implied note, that next implied word. Everything crosses into that, right? And so you can spend your entire life analyzing each of those moves and being like, holy shit, everything was implied. Like, all of those things, all of those sources of inspiration, all of those various things are being pointed to here, right? But the beauty of improvisation and the mystery of improvisation is that it's purely spontaneous, and none of those things were clearly defined, explicit reasons. It was just that there was this total freedom for the next moment to express everything. In retrospect, we can see the implicit crossing also in what comes smoothly. It is an implicit crossing of an odd kind of many, a many that have never existed separately. Yeah, like I was saying, that everything, right? Our whole life of experience and influence and inspiration has just implied into the next thing. But we never separated out all of those influences and they're like, I'm gonna be inspired by that thing right now. It's just all of that is in us, and if we are fully like free to be spontaneous, all of that can just simply come out into the next thing. They never existed separately, but we can look backwards and begin to separate those out. But at no point will we have been able to separate out every possible thing that influenced that next move, because it is everything. Everything by everything. Ev. That's the term in process model. Ev. Ev. This term involves the quantitative scheme of many, but with that scheme exceeded by the familiar implicit crossing, which is more intricate and different than the scheme of many. Right? Like many has this sense of a bunch of particular things, but we're using it now to say something like that, but not, there's like a multiplicity, but none of the things within that multiplicity are existing separately. As soon as we have this more than concept about how next steps come crossed, we can cross it with how words come. The right words come just as if someone had gone through all the words so as to select just the right ones, and all phrasing possibilities so as to phrase just what we wanted to say. But we let this conceptual scheme be about what exceeds it, namely, the implicit crossing by which the right words actually come. Right? As if someone had gone through all the possibilities to select the right ones, but that's not actually how it works. We can explain it as if that's what's happening, but what's happening is actually much more than that. It's actually this implicit crossing. Okay, and then the third question. How can we think about the coming from underneath? Will it come wholly alive from underneath tonight at the concert? In Homer's Iliad, people often consult their thumos. I think that would be the way to say that. Thymos. Timos. Which talks back to them from within their chests. Oh, interesting. I'm curious now, because what I was saying before about the daemon, I want to explore that further. Whether the thumos is more accurate for what I'm getting at. I don't know. Another take on this was to personify the source of improvisation as the muse. Actually, let me quickly just search so that I don't forget. Okay. Jungians personify the unconscious as continuous with our conscious ego on one side, but continuous with God or the universe on the other side. Clearly, there are many takes on this coming, all fanciful if taken just as statements alone. None of them make sense unless we let the familiar coming function in our saying. I'm reminded too, like the daemon from what I'm remembering, is in Greek mythology too, is like that inner voice. It's the divine voice occurring within the human. And if I'm remembering correctly, like Hermes, what's his name in Roman mythology? But anyway, Hermes, right, the god with the winged sandals, he's like he's the god most closely associated with that daemon, because Hermes is the messenger god between humans and the gods. So the daemon is that voice inside of you, that still small voice. In as they say in the Bible, you listen for that still small voice, and that is the voice of God. And yeah, that's that connection within the human of the divine voice speaking within you. And when you're free of all these various burdens and layers and constrictions and identities and all these things, traumas, you can be sensitive enough to notice that that's something, that still small voice within you. Considered as schemes, they can contradict each other. But if we keep the implicit intricacy with us, if we let the words and schemes say the implicit intricacy that is more than they say, then many ways of saying it make sense. Then we can also further see how carries a different strand of meaning forward in what we already had implicitly. I feel like there's a word missing in that, or I'm just reading this wrong. Then we can also further see how it carries a different strand of meaning forward in what we already had implicitly. Right, so if we're just talking about the unconscious, or if we're just talking about thumos, if we're just talking about the muse, or just talking about the daemon, those concepts can all butt up against each other, and then we get in a fight about which ones are correct and what's what. But we can also be like, what is implied by all these things? Like, there's a bigger thing. There's a experience that's being implied by all these things. Each one helps us highlight that implicit experience in different ways, right? That's how Gendlin talks about theory too, is like a theory allows you to pluck certain nuances of experience out that you might not otherwise have seen without that theory. But you don't have to stick with the theory. Now that you have plucked that little bit of experience out, you can examine that all by itself, right? So as with theory, as with scheme, and as with concept, when we talk about thumos, or when we talk about the muse or the unconscious, each one of those in their own unique way allows us to think about that experience in a unique specifics, and it allows us to pluck out parts of that experience in different ways. But they don't have to contradict each other, right? Once we've plucked those little bits of experience out, those bits of experience don't contradict each other, but the schemes can. But if we let the words and the schemes say the implicit intricacy that is more than they say, then many ways of saying it make sense. Then we can say how saying it, carries a different strand of meaning forward in what we already had implicitly. We can also freshly improvise and say more. What comes in this way from beyond my control feels more truly me than what I deliberately construct. That is why improvisation is so highly valued and intensely involving. Coming in this way, it is not just the novel form. Rather, it has the electricity of living. It feels more truly me to me, another odd phrase, and also more alive to others, the audience, for example. Yeah, I feel like this essay, this paper is really helping me articulate the reason why my Twitter name is what it is. Demonic is about being yourself and getting to listen to that implicit intricacy in yourself, which is most truly you, and living through that, letting it be alive and moving forward through that. That's what demonic is. That's what it means to me anyway, to be demonic. Listening to that inner voice, learning to listen to whatever it is, that whatever scheme we use to talk about it, right? Whether thumos or muse or the unconscious or that still, quiet inner voice, learning to listen to that felt sense, that implicit intricacy, because that is the most intricate, alive expression, the next implication of your particular unique life. So that's you living. And being demonic is all about learning to live and be attuned to that. We can let this facet be a concept, a very important one. The more truly me is omitted when we have only the score or only the decided way to play it. Anything that is just content, just an object, just a percept, just an image, omits the truly me from underneath which comes alive when we improvise and first generate the content from underneath. The score or script does not just omit the improvisation that creates it. It omits us. Our proviso, improvisation first, is now revealed to include and save the human subject. Fuck. I'm so glad I'm reading this. Yeah, right? This is kind of like what I was saying about not writing things yet, because I don't yet know what form these ideas need to take. And I don't want to shove them into a form and then lose the me part of it in so doing. All right? And in doing it this way, in not having a form that I'm beholden to, only me, I'm allowing myself to constantly be checking back with what is it that wants to be said, what's implied, and letting that come forth. And as I do that more and more, I get clearer on what I mean and what I want to say and how to articulate it, and eventually it will take shape, perhaps, into something more final that I can then share. But that final thing is going to have me in it more than if I were just to say, like, I want to write an essay or like a blog post or fucking, Twitter thread explaining my ideas, right? I would have to cut away a lot of me and not even discover a lot of me, because I would not have gone through the process of letting it come up from underneath. But to say, it feels more truly me to me seems to involve two of me, one who reports this, the one who refused to construct and waited for something to come, and the other more truly me. Those are clearly not the same, nor two things. They are more intricate. we can allow the scheme of 1 and 2 to say what is more than that scheme. This is much more intricate, but implicitly familiar way in which what comes by this coming feels more truly me than what I fully control. Whoa, okay. I gotta go back through that. Let's see. So I'm saying it feels more truly me to me involves identifying 2. One who reports on it and the other one. The experienced one and the one that reports on it and makes the judgment. Those aren't the same, nor are they entirely distinct. This paragraph's kind of hard to parse. We can allow the scheme of 1 and 2 to say what is more than that scheme. It is both 1 and 2. Right? This is what internal family systems is about. This is what focusing is about. It's like we are one, but we are also many. This is what Aristotle talks about in De Anima. Our soul is both one unified thing, and it is also many things. This much more intricate but implicitly familiar way in which what comes by this coming feels more truly me than what I fully control. Right? This spontaneous expression feels more fully me than what I fully control. Because if I control it, I'm cutting out things, right? I'm cutting out some of that stuff that comes from underneath. So it's not all of me. That stuff that comes from underneath, that seeps through the cracks, so to speak, is more truly me because you're not cutting anything away. Anyway, that's how I'm understanding that for now. For now, upon first read. Instead of positing selves to explain the coming, we can turn this about and say that more truly me is inherently a living forward from underneath, which gets to live when I improvise, right? So it's not necessarily that there are many selves, many parts of us, but that stuff that's coming up from underneath is this life forward. It is me that's coming up from underneath, and it gets to live when I improvise, right? Rather than when I perform this fixed final form, I'm not getting to fully live. None of that stuff is getting to come up from underneath. I've fixed the form. I'm controlling it. There's none of that intricacy anymore. And you've cut off the life that wants to be expressed. But since the body implies the next step is the more me, just the body? No. Just the body means the body as a thing. My body, like my car. But in improvising, the body is between me and more me, continuous with them in a bodily coming. Right? The body is not an object as we're talking about it here. The body is me, and it is the more me. The body is that which expresses the coming up from underneath. right? Those felt senses, those things that we don't have words for yet, those movements that we want to make, those sounds that we want to make because we don't know how to yet explain ourselves in words. That's the coming up from underneath. So my body is me now, and it's also that which comes up from underneath what I am now and carries forward and lives forward. And there's continuity in that, right? And if I let it bubble up and come from underneath, then I am that too. And now I'm there, and there's going to be more coming up from underneath. All this would be nonsensical if taken as concepts alone. But if it makes sense when said in that coming, then the implicit sense, which is more than a scheme, is said by the scheme of two and a body between. Then that is not nonsense. On the contrary, it begins to provide a way about talking. On the contrary, it begins to provide a way of talking about the human subject. All this would be nonsensical if taken as, but if it makes sense, and sense obviously has this unique sense here, since we're not talking solely about explicit, articulate sense, right? But also about something that implied felt sense. But if it makes sense when said in that coming, right? So if, I think what he would be saying there, if it makes sense when said in that coming, right? If the coming up from underneath is expressed and it makes sense as the thing that is implied next, that's something, then the implicit sense, which is more than a scheme, is said by the scheme of two and then the implicit sense, which is more than a scheme, is said by the scheme of two and a body between. So the implicit sense, which is more than a scheme, is said by the scheme of two and a body between, right? So the two and a body between conceptually implies the implicit sense of that which comes up from underneath. There's me, and there's my body, and there's that further me. And that scheme implies this whole experience that we've been talking about, of things being implied, that felt sense of like, there's a further thing to do, to say, to make, right? The further brush stroke. And that provides us a way of talking about ourselves as human subjects rather than as objects. Our concept of the human subject is saved, retrieved from both the old schemes and the current incapacity to speak of ourselves at all. Both are obviated by improvisation, by the fact that I can improvise a pattern about more me that is more me and much more intricate than the old notions. A pattern that says how this coming is more than the pattern. Our concept of the human subject is saved. It's retrieved from the old schemes and the current incapacity to speak of ourselves at all. That's interesting. The incapacity to speak of ourselves at all. Again, it reminds me of that thing I mentioned at the beginning, which I had tweeted about recently, of like, be wary of theories which make yourself and your experience seem impossible, because there are theories and ways of relating to those theories which make it almost impossible to really acknowledge our own lived experience. And so we become incapable to talk about our own experience, and everything that we actually experience is just like fucking woo-woo. Right? It doesn't fit into theory. So it's just fucking woo. It doesn't make sense. Right? And then people just easily brush it off. But all of that is gotten rid of basically by improvisation, by the fact that I can improvise a pattern about more me. And I think what he's maybe saying there is like the fact that he did that in a way through this whole paper, right? Step by step, playing with the concepts, improvising his way forward. I can improvise a pattern about more me that is more me and much more intricate than the old notions. A pattern that says how this coming is more than the pattern. If I can do this in a few moments improvisation, I know it is possible to do better on these and many other topics that we currently seem unable to talk about, provided that no matter how excellent our concepts become, we always still also keep the implicitly familiar coming of improvisation with us, keeping it as part of our saying, so that the concepts say how the implicit sense is more than the concepts, so that we always also come freshly from underneath. Yeah. Wow. So glad that I discovered that this paper exists and that it was short enough for me to read in this way. Yeah. I really hope that people actually watch this, or maybe I'm going to have to, turn this into more of a formalized piece of writing to share, because I feel like it articulates so much behind everything I'm doing and thinking and how I'm operating in like so many areas of my life. On Twitter, in Shift 30 for 30, etc. Right? This is what I'm all about. So, wow. If you have watched this, thank you. And I would love so much to hear your thoughts. So please don't hesitate to reach out and share your thoughts, your questions, your comments, your reflections on this. This is the kind of shit I am so in love with talking about, and exploring together with people. So if you also want to have those conversations, I am so ready for it. All right. So until then, take care.